Welcome back for another video about Path of Exile, and today it's to talk about a new build I tried out, which is the Triple-Herald Blade Vortex Scion. Yeah, Scion is actually still a class in the game, as little as you may see it. So I wanted to try out this build because I wanted something that would be kind of fun to play and would have a good chance at exploding big packs of Delirium monsters. After the patch changes, I think Delirium has become a lot more manageable and also quite rewarding if you can manage to do it quickly, and so I thought this character might be a good way to do it. As for PoE veterans, I'm sure they're familiar with the tri-herald Blade Vortex Elementalist, which was really popular a couple of leagues back. Since then, there were a couple of nerfs to both Blade Vortex and the Elementalist Ascendancy, and while this is still a pretty strong build, it's not nearly as popular, and most people are now doing it with Assassin. My thought was, after seeing a lot of the new Cluster Jewel notables, which give some really significant buffs if you use Heralds, and they give buffs both to your damage and to the effect of the Herald, that maybe we could do something really strong by stacking a lot of these jewels together, because unlike other notables, it's actually possible to get multiple of the same notable if you're getting them from cluster jewels. So my thought was, well, Scion gets a few extra passive points on the tree, and these new cluster jewels are very passive point hungry, so what could go wrong? Let's make a Scion Blade Vortex character. And I had a moderate degree of success. I would say this build is kind of it's a win some, lose some, because it's really good at some parts of the content and not so great at the others. So in this video, I'll give a rundown of what the build is, then I'll talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of it, and then hopefully you can decide if this sort of build is something you would want to try as well. I do think that the cluster jewels in general are offering a lot of really cool possibilities that were not available before, so I'm really looking forward to the other creative solutions that people are coming up with based on these cluster jewels to do things that are perhaps even more effective than what I've come up with here. Let me give you a rundown of how this build is intended to work. The main skill is Blade Vortex, supported by Controlled Destruction, Hypothermia, Physical Delightning to convert 50% to Elemental, and then Unleash just for quality of life to not have to cast it all the time. We accomplish the other 50% conversion over to Elemental in Cold using the Hrimburn gloves, which are very cheap to acquire, and then socketed in there I just have my golems on a cast when damage taken setup. So then my movement skill, Whirling Blades, linked to Fortify just to get around a little bit more quickly, and then my heralds, I've got Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ash over here, Flame Dash for going up and down ledges, then Herald of Ice linked to Ice Bite for Frenzy Charge generation, increased crits to have a better chance at getting chain reactions off of the Herald of Ice explosions, and then Onslaught for an occasional speed boost when I'm busy clearing through maps. The other gear, this is actually part of what motivated me to make this character, is this ridiculous amulet dropped with crit multi, energy shield, level to physical skill gems, and some life on it. So I've got arcane swiftness on there, which gives a bonus while wearing a shield to spell damage and block, and also gives some chance to avoid ailments. I've got some more chance to avoid ailments on my mask, and the rest gets taken care of on the passive tree. I'll show you that in a second. Then in the boots, just the cast when damage taken, steel skin, and tempest shield for a little bit of a defensive layer. And here's where the build's kind of core theme comes from, is using Soul Tether for a lot of sustain on energy shield. For anyone who hasn't used the Soul Tether belt before, it actually creates a pretty unique style of play, because your energy shield is constantly draining down, but if you've got life leech, then it will both refill your life and then refill your energy shield, and it refills very, very quickly. So it makes it so you can take big hits and then recover from them very fast. The problem is, of course, that if you're a spellcaster, often you don't have access to a lot of leech, especially as a Scion, but my thought was we can get that through some pretty creative use of the new cluster jewels. So really, this is where the core of the build is. It's just come out from Scion, come up, get a bunch of cluster jewels, come down, get a bunch more cluster jewels, and then just whatever life nodes I can squeeze in along the way. So kind of the build around for this is Doriani's Lesson, which gives 0.2% of elemental damage leeches life. That with Soul Tether is pretty great for sustain. And actually I don't need any more than 0.2%. For a little while I had planned around having two different Doriani's Lesson jewels, ended up being totally unnecessary. And The other part that I wanted to try out is stacking as many Herald buffing jewels as I could. So over here I've got Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, which gives some crit for Heralds, and Endbringer, 25% damage for each Herald, so 3 Heralds, 75% damage. Over here, some increased AoE for Herald skills, only 1 Heraldry passive, and you actually need to just have 1 in order to make the mana sustain manageable, because the Scion doesn't get the same benefit as Elementalist of reduced mana reservation, but just 1 Heraldry with the 10% reduced mana res is enough to make that work with 3 Heralds plus our supports on Herald of Ice. And then down here we've got another Dark Messenger for more increased AoE of Heralds, another Endbringer for another 75% total increased damage, and yet another Endbringer for another 75% increased damage. So 225% increased damage off of Endbringer. How could that possibly be bad? Then Empowered Envoy, I wasn't entirely sure which of these other ones, like Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, Empowered Envoy, the non-Endbringer passives you can get from the notables. I wasn't sure which of those was best, so I just kind of grabbed a couple of each. Then down here, I've got these small jewels. I took 2 Elegant Form. Those give a little bit of dodge chance, but also more chance to avoid elemental ailments. So in total, with my helmet and the Arcane Swiftness, I've got over 100% avoidance on all elemental ailments, which I think is really cool to do whenever you can manage it on a character. So that's the concept of the build, is I wanted to take advantage of Heralds as much as possible and just push that to the maximum, but I have run into a few problems in doing that. I've only been playing this character for a couple of days now. It's level 84, but that's been long enough for me to notice a few of the downsides, and I think it's important when trying new things to be very upfront and frank with the problems you have as well, so that other people can hopefully learn from and not repeat them. One of the big problems for this build is unfortunately a performance-related one. The sound for the Herald of Ice explosions, at least for me, causes some horrible frame drops and game lags in kind of unpredictable ways. Sometimes it'll be going fine, and then others my frames will drop down to nothing, and then I will suddenly die, which is just kind of frustrating and obviously would be a really big problem if I were foolish enough to attempt a build like this in hardcore. The other problem with the build, setting aside performance issues, because maybe that's just my computer, although I know a few others have been having similar problems, but this build is just so point hungry that I've only had the ability to take a small handful of life nodes. When I was designing it, I really underestimated how many perks it actually takes to take each of those cluster jewel spots, and even assuming you don't travel at all to get to them, it takes 3 perk points just to allocate the cluster jewel. Then you're taking maybe at least 7 new perks to fill up the large wheel, assuming you get a really good one. And then the medium wheels are 4 each, so if I have 2 medium jewels, that's another 8 perks. So now I'm suddenly up to 18 perks into just 1 cluster wheel. And since I want 2 in order to make the build really function, that's over a third of the build's total passives going into cluster jewels, and it's something that I just didn't anticipate. And so it does have a big trade-off when it comes to survivability, because even though this build has a lot of sustain using the soul tether to regenerate energy shield really quickly and cushion against hits, it still gets one-shotted pretty regularly because I just don't have any damage mitigation, and my health is only around 4,000 in total between energy shield and life right now, which just isn't enough for the tier of content that I'm doing. So I would have to level up probably another 10 times to go from 84 to the early 90s in order to have an adequate amount of health. And when you have survivability issues at this stage, then leveling up suddenly becomes a big problem, because if you're dying every now and then, it's just not going to happen for you. So that's the big problem with the build, is I made something that was so perk hungry in order to take advantage of the cluster jewels. There just isn't the ability to get the life nodes fast enough. Maybe if I had leveled this differently by prioritizing life nodes first and then taking the second set of cluster jewels later, that would have solved it, but not really. Because when you do cluster jewels, as you're planning out a build with them, you quickly find you want to allocate a lot of them all at once so that you can get to your medium jewels as fast as possible. And so just putting 1 perk there at a time just isn't very satisfying. It just doesn't feel very good. So that's, I think, the big takeaway that I have for this build is it was all right, and it clears stuff pretty well in specific areas, but it has some definite weaknesses. Perhaps the biggest problem with it is that it's doing something that another build probably just does a little bit better, which is the assassin version, which even before there were all the cluster jewels available, the cold conversion Blade Vortex Assassin is a very, very strong and viable character, and probably a little bit better than this one. It also has the advantage of not having to tie up a bunch of currency into cluster jewel wheels in the tree, which are neat to play with, but ultimately in this case probably not the most efficient way to do things. Anyway, that's my review of this build. You can check the description for a path of building if you're curious to see it. There will not be any written guide for this because I don't think I would encourage other people to try it, but I've learned a little bit from playing this up and it was kind of fun along the way. So if you're interested in seeing this or similar content, do hit subscribe. I may have more things to come in the future.